But nowadays, they're in the digital age, there are much more actors that challenge them. And that's why it's also important to look at it from a journalism perspective, because we also then understand how journalism is affected and how journalism and journalists might need to adapt.
Welcome to the Kaiserschild Podcast, in which we talk about research projects and results that have emerged from the Kaiserschild Advance program. Today I'm talking to Clara Juarez Miro and Phoebe Maares, who have realized an interesting research project in the field of journalism. Clara Juarez Miro currently is a Beatriz Galindo Distinguished Researcher in the Department of Political Science at the University of Barcelona, and previously was a postdoctoral researcher at the Journalism Studies Center at the Department of Communication at the university here in Vienna. She works in journalism studies, focusing on online communities, identity politics, as well as audience expectations of news. Phoebe Maares is a postdoctoral researcher at the Journalism Studies Center at the University of Vienna and managing an Austrian Science Fund project on the blurring boundaries of journalism. In her research, she focuses on journalism in the digital age, changes to the profession, and how this affects what kind of knowledge is produced for society. And you did your research. We are going to talk about today with Jonathan Hendricks, assistant professor at the Copenhagen University. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
So, you did your research in the Kaiserschild Advance program on non-traditional journalistic actors and their authority in specific communities. Why did you choose this topic?
This project came to be from taking stock about the worldwide trends of declining news use and trust, and the tension that happens between journalists' ideals of objectivity and detachment and audiences' demands for more engagement from them. In between this tension, we have that non-traditional journalistic actors can actually successfully assert authority in specific communities by precisely deviating from these traditional journalistic values. So these actors challenge traditional business models, and their emergence has completely destabilized the journalistic field. But we still don't quite understand how community membership can shape these claims of journalistic authority. So we wanted to address this gap with this research by examining how very diverse journalistic actors in two specific niche communities can base their claims on proximity to their sources, authenticity as recognized by the audience community, and professionalism in relation to the journalistic field.
Why are these non-traditional journalistic actors relevant to journalism today?
As Clara already said, they are relevant because they are much better in fostering an intimate relationship to audiences. And by doing that, they're challenging journalism's role as an institution that provides knowledge and that has an authority to observe and document and ultimately also defining reality, what reality is about. And these new actors, these non-traditional actors, challenge this authority that journalism had for a very long time. Journalism as an institution has always competed for this authority with other knowledge producers, but nowadays they're in the digital age. There are much more actors that challenge them. And that's why it's also important to look at it from a journalism perspective, because we also then understand how journalism is affected and how journalism and journalists might need to adapt.
But what exactly are non-traditional journalistic actors, and beyond that, in which communities do you select to investigate such actors?
Maybe I can also answer that question. So non-traditional journalistic actors are people who produce and disseminate primarily factual content. So not necessarily people who write fiction to an audience, to a broader audience, but they are outside of what we would consider traditional journalistic news organizations. So the term is relatively broad, but it can capture a range of different people that produce content alone or in smaller collectives on social media or on their own websites or in podcasts. And I think for this study, it's important to point out that these non-traditional actors, just as Clara said earlier in her answer, can be much more deeply immersed in certain subcultures or fandom communities. And that means that they also have a different and often deeper knowledge about the subject that they are reporting on, rather than a journalist who just looks into this subject once and then continues on to a different subject that is newsworthy. And so for this study, we selected two different communities. One is the Eurovision Song Contest, and which probably a lot of people know. And the other one is Republika, which is a festival about digital politics, culture, and democracy, and which is held annually in Berlin.
Could you take us a little bit into the examination situation? What was the atmosphere like at the events, for example, the European Song Contest or the Republika? And what are the relevant differences between the journalistic actors in these environments? Phoebe.
Mm-hmm. So maybe let's start with the atmosphere, what the atmosphere was like. Unfortunately, we only know about the atmosphere of Eurovision secondhand because we were not there. Clara and I were at Republika, and our colleague Jonathan was at Eurovision. But in general, what we know from discussing the different two settings, we know that at Eurovision, it's much more structured, also in terms of who's allowed to participate as a journalist or non-traditional journalistic actor. They all need to have accreditation. They have a different press media center for the non-traditional actors and one for the traditional actors. So there's also a geographic separation between the two, whereas at Republika, it's much more dispersed. People can join on a press accreditation. They can also volunteer, helping with organizing the festival and joining for free, or they can just buy a normal day pass. And so not everyone needed a press accreditation. And they also didn't have a specifically marked off press area. So it was much more fluid and non-hierarchical, I would say.
I can talk a little bit about the people we interviewed in each setting. So we ended up doing 27 interviews with journalistic actors, but the people attending each event and the people being members of each community was very different, as reflected in the people that we interviewed. So from these 27 interviews, 12 were conducted at the Eurovision Song Contest and 15 at Republika. And we found a very hybrid mix of actors in the diversity of the level of institutionalization. So we had broadsheet newspaper journalists and journalists that were in public broadcasters. We also talked to freelancers, hybrid reporters that worked both for mass and niche media, and also journalistic actors that were reporting for fan media and from social media platforms. So very diverse set of journalistic actors. And I can just touch very briefly on the people that we talked to. So we talked to 16 people that identified as men, 10 as women, and 1 person identified as non-binary. And the average age, so it also gives you an idea of the ages that attend these events, was 40 for our interviewees. And we talked to them for about 23 minutes. So that's kind of the breakdown.
You were just talking about fan and niche media. What's the difference between those two?
This is a very good question. And it's one that we grappled with as we were defining the theory for our study. Niche media, so their focus is on a specific topic is very narrow as compared to generalist media. And their knowledge, and Phoebe touched on this briefly before too, so there are different kinds and levels of knowledge that these journalistic actors have of these communities or specific communities. So for niche media, this would be a deep, very specialized, but still institutionalized knowledge. So we talk about institutionalized knowledge when we talk about knowledge acquired through formal education, for example. So we're talking about very specialized, but still formally journalists in the case of niche media. And then for fan media, these are journalistic actors that their knowledge stems from everyday interactions with a community that they're part of. So they're members of the community that they're covering. It's less institutionalized. And because of this, they have a little bit more leeway in the kind of style they use. So it tends to be more effective. And this is also a huge element of what fandom is. So fan actors are also fans of the community. And this means that their relationship with the object of fandom or fellow fans is very effective, very deep engagement. And so they engage in other practices like collective meaning making and cultural production and distribution. So they're not as tied down by journalistic standards, even though they can follow and adhere to them too when they call themselves fan journalistic actors.
And initially, before we dive a little bit deeper into the theory behind your research, why did you initially have chosen Republika and the European Song Contest as object of research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we selected these both cases on the basis of comparing two very different fandom communities. So one of them is concerned with pop culture, which we also assume to be very, as Clara just pointed out, very embedded, like very obsessive to an extent even. And the other one is concerned more with politics and democracy, because while fandom research for a long time only looked at fandoms surrounding pop culture, more recently there has also been an argument that people also actually form fandom communities around political issues. And so we chose this approach to uncover differences but also similarities in the ways in which these different journalistic actors, so journalists, niche journalists, but also these fan reporters within these two different communities assert their authority and also engage in deciding who could be considered a legitimate participant in this conversation.
Journalistic authority, as you mentioned, is the huge concept in your research. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, Clara?
Yes, definitely. So when an actor is recognized as an observer and chronicler of reality, as a creator of knowledge, and as someone that defines truth and what facts are, then we say this actor has journalistic authority. So journalistic authority, in other words, shapes who is recognized as rightful reporter, explainer, and definer of reality. And an important element of authority is that it has to be recognized or awarded. So someone can just unilaterally claim authority. In this case, by the audiences or the sources of these journalistic actors. But especially, it can also be recognized by other journalistic actors. And especially for this, journalism studies has kind of focused on how other actors accept or reject these other claims by fellow actors. But our study is also kind of putting the focus on other communities that might be recognizing or not of this authority, like I said before, the sources and the audiences.
What is the origin of this concept?
So, as Clara just said, journalistic authority is in journalism studies is often viewed through or only perceived through standards of journalistic professionalism. So, what other actors actually think is a professional journalist. And this is also often on the basis of whether the journalist makes claims based in basic journalistic practices like researching information, rechecking that information, fact-checking quotes and sources, and also not being influenced in their work and so on. And we argue that actually journalistic authority also has other dimension, as Clara just said, namely the protagonists, so the people that are being reported on, and the audience. So the audience also has to acknowledge a journalistic authority. They also have to accept that this person that claims to provide relevant information is in fact doing it in the correct way for them. And here, the concept of professionalism is not enough, because audiences and sources act also with other parameters to assess whether something has this legitimacy and authority. And so we drew on concepts from other fields, from other research fields, not only journalism studies, namely fandom studies, but also digital and influencer media studies, where we know that aspects like proximity, so that someone is actually able to access someone, to talk with them, to be close to them, to be near to them, is a really important aspect to claim and to grant authority, but also authenticity. So whether what I tell you to be true, whether you think that that's actually true, whether it meets your expectations. That's why we combined these three dimensions to understand journalistic authority outside of the traditional newsroom.
Clara, what do the results tell us about the relevance of these three concepts: proximity, authenticity, and professionality?
I would say that the most important contribution of the study is exactly bringing up these two other dimensions that matter for claiming and having your authority recognized. We have for a long time tended to focus on the relationships among journalistic actors, but our results suggest that actually the relationship of journalistic actors with their sources or the event protagonists and their audiences and also their fellow journalistic actors all matter when they are claiming this authority to define knowledge. But also, one of our most perhaps surprising results was that we found that actually for audiences in our interviewees in these communities, professionalism was not as relevant as we would have thought based on the literature. So this also suggests that journalists may need to adapt their work and maybe think of these two dimensions too when they do it, to be able to serve their audiences better. And so they can continue to have this authority recognized by them, which is crucial if you think, going back to how I started, we have this declining trust and use of news. And so it might be a moment of reckoning to really think about how to adapt to all the economic transformations going on now in the journalistic field.
Phoebe, was there something surprising for you as well?
Yeah, so additionally to what Clara just said, so that professionalism was actually not that prominent in the ways that our respondents talked about their journalistic authority or how they claim it. I was surprised to hear how many people that we sampled as traditional journalists were also part of the fandom community in the case of Eurovision, and how some of them dealt with this identity of being a fan, of sometimes even being an obsessive fan, which is very much in contrast to traditional journalistic norms like being more objective and being more detached in their reporting. So, what we found in these cases is that some of them report for mass media, but then they have their additional little fan project, like a podcast or a blog, or they also report on social media and bring their audiences with them behind the scenes. And there they could speak much more subjectively on the Eurovision Song Contest. And I think that's not only surprising, so it was a surprising finding for me, but it's also tying back to what Clara just said, that maybe these norms of detached reporting, objective reporting, is not necessarily the only and right way to claim authority in the digital age, where there's just so much more information that's also sometimes much more subjective and engaging for audiences.
So there are differences in the reporting styles when the same person does the more fan-oriented production than the more objective journalism-like production?
Yeah, so we did not look at the content that they were producing, but from how they talked about the different projects that they are producing from Eurovision, we can deduct that. And it's also interesting that they're actually also reflecting on this tension between being a reporter for mass media and having their podcast where they can speak more freely.
Clara, have there been any differences between the European Song Contests and the Republika?
Yeah, so kind of tying to what Phoebe just said, all the actors that we interviewed in both settings were very much hybrid. So the differences that we were expecting to be perhaps a bit more clear-cut were not so clear-cut. So that was another finding. But some of the differences came to the different specificities of how the event was organized. For example, for the Eurovision Song Contest, the fan media had a specific accreditation that named them as fan media, so they very explicitly identified with that label, while for the Republika attendees, those are very diverse journalistic actors, and even though they might have very much strong affective attachments to the community, they might not explicitly identify as fans of Republika, right? So that was a clear difference between the two events that shaped our findings. Then we also have that. So for the fan media in Eurovision, there was a certain aspirational element of practicing journalism, while for the Republika attendees, the boundaries that they drew between them being journalistic or not was much more explicit, and if in a way more clear that if they did not identify as journalistic, they were very much rejecting that, very clearly not identifying as such. So in that sense, the way that these boundaries were discursively drawn between journalistic and non-journalistic or hybrid or fans, it was very different in both events. And so as we were analyzing the results, that was something that we had to take into account. Those, I would say, were the most striking differences between both events.
So we see developments concerning the profession, concerning how the profession is perceived and how journalists, fan or niche or mass, perceive themselves. How is this affecting journalism in the future?
So I think what we can draw from the study, and that also kind of ties back to what Clara said earlier, is that traditional journalistic media have to make a stronger case for why their work and the knowledge that they produce is relevant for audiences. And this also, I think, requires some societal support. So some form of funding for media that is actually providing societally relevant news. Because we know from audience studies that we also both did, separate from this project, that many audiences are also used to just receive information for free anywhere. And if the news that you need to live your daily life, if that news just finds you and you don't need to pay anything, why would you all of a sudden need to start rethinking that, right? So that's one of the issues. But I also think that journalists must meet their audiences where they are. And that's maybe not necessarily always in a newspaper, especially not a printed one. And they also need to be more embedded in different communities. So either local or thematic. And I think for some communities, that's more important than for others. But I think that's an issue that journalism as a whole should consider.
Clara, Phoebe, thank you so much for this interesting insights into your research.
Thank you.
Thank you.